And I was thinking today, about my grandfather when he came here in 1908, whatever electric devices they had in their little house there on Wells Street, that power was coming from the Twin Branch Dam. And when my dad was born in 1943, he would have been that newborn at St. Joseph Hospital, and the lights in the delivery room were powered by Twin Branch electricity, mostly from the steam plant. And all that wonderful history of Mishawaka High School that we talk about. Well, when that building opened in 1924, that power was coming from the dam, and as they added on to it, that power was coming from the steam plant. And so it just impacted people every day in every way, even if they didn't pause to think about it.
You heard that there. That is Mishawaka historian and reoccurring now and then round the bend guest Pete DeKever, talking about the widespread impact that the Twin Branch Dam had in providing electricity to our community. More of that later, but first, thank you for listening to another episode of Round the Bend Now and Then. My name is Matt Emery, and I'm a local history nerd. My main mission in this podcast, as well as other Round the Bend material, is to create engaging content that shares how intertwined the South Bend and Mishawaka area's past is to our present. In the podcast, I interview local leaders, business owners, and community members to help tell their stories, because their stories help tell the story of South Bend and Mishawaka. In this episode, I meet with the president and curator of the Mishawaka Historical Museum, Pete DeKever. Pete is in first place as a reoccurring guest on our podcast, as this is his fourth time joining us. As you've learned previously, Pete's passion, knowledge, and research about all things Mishawaka local history is clearly evident. He's authored several books, written dozens and dozens of articles, made many presentations, has led many historical walking tours, and is the driving force behind the operation of the Mishawaka Historical Museum. In this episode, we talk about a chapter from his most recent book, Lost Mishawaka. The book contains 17 different chapters, each about a different story, business, or person that are now gone from our daily lives. As I always stress to our listeners, anytime that we interview an author or cover something in their book, that 45 minutes to an hour merely scratches the surface of what content is inside of the book. So I highly recommend that you purchase the book and enjoy learning more about all of this history right under our noses. The link to his book, Lost Mishawaka, is in our show notes. The specific chapter that we discuss for this episode is called When Mishawaka Was Power City, the story of the Twin Branch Dam and Power Plant. You've probably seen the Twin Branch Dam on the St. Joe River near Capitol and Lincoln Way. The dam is a massive structure, and it is evident that it was built with a purpose. But if you're like me, you probably didn't know too much history about the area. That massive dam was only a part of the entire Twin Branch Dam and Power Plant. There was a huge area on the north side of the river that contained massive steam plant buildings that once powered the entire city of Mishawaka and beyond. As you'll hear, creating power there was a very complex process involving coal, water, steam, electricity, and much, much more. But now, that complex is but a distant memory. Prior to the interview, Pete and I met at the Twin Branch Dam and Power Plant site. He showed me where the massive steam plant once stood, right between the river and Jefferson Boulevard, and how the train tracks once supplied the coal to the plant. Now, the area contains a light industrial park, a dog park, a marina, and a fish hatchery. But it's amazing that for decades that land was churning out electricity 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Thank you, Pete, for joining us and for sharing your knowledge and passion. Before we dive into the interview with Pete, I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors of this episode. You'll hear more about them later in the episode, but I wanted to let them know that I truly appreciate their support, and I definitely encourage our listeners to support them as well. A huge thank you to MT Box Computers, the Portage Township Trustee Office, as well as the Mishawaka Historical Museum. 3 awesome spots that I encourage you to support. And now, learn all about the Twin Branch Dam and Power Plant in our interview with Mishawaka historian Pete DeKever. Hey, Pete, thanks for joining us again on Round the Bend Now and Then. We were talking the other day that this is your fourth time on, and you've been on our show the most as a reoccurring guest.
Well, thank you for having me, Matt.
For sure. Yeah, we met about the Mishawaka Historical Museum, to which you are the president and curator of. We met about Steel Stadium bleachers, met about the 100th anniversary, the 100th birthday of Mishawaka High School, and then now we are here to talk about a chapter in your newest book, which is called Lost Mishawaka, is the book. And folks, as I always say, it's impossible to truly summarize a book in a 45-minute podcast episode. So you have to go out and get the book. I'll include a link in our show notes and on social media as well. Pete, you want to talk a little bit about your newest book, Lost Mishawaka, how it came to fruition and what it's mainly about?
Sure. Lost Mishawaka consists of 17 essays, and the unifying idea behind the book is things that are no more in Mishawaka. And we're not including persons who are deceased, but it's elements of the downtown that no longer exist, businesses, industries, particular buildings. And there is a series of books from Arcadia that's lost blank.
Okay.
So there could be a lost Kokomo or a lost Indianapolis.
Yeah.
And so I had a number of previously written essays that fit nicely into the lost idea. And really most of what I write about is things that are no more. And so it wasn't that difficult to find these essays that could fit the lost idea. So we're remembering these things that are no more, these institutions or businesses, but also celebrating them.
Yeah, absolutely. And folks, when you get the book, you'll see that there's obviously texts or descriptions and narrative, but there's awesome old pictures of Mishawaka, stories behind everything, businesses, downtown, industry. You wrote about the what was that? The circus?
The street carnival.
Yeah, the street carnival. That's
yes.
wild right there in itself. We could probably do a whole episode on that. I'll have a link in the show notes to this and encourage our folks to go get it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Now, we're going to talk about a specific chapter in your book titled When Mishawaka Was the Power City, the story behind the Twin Branch Dam and Power Plant. Now, most of our listeners know by now that hydropower was very important to early industry. It's not like you could turn a light switch on and just have electricity like today. I mean, they use water for it. Industrialists and city leaders knew that the power of the river's current could be captured and used to power mills, factories, and so forth. The Twin Branch Dam that we're talking about is just east of the Capitol Street Bridge, and then Lincoln Way, north of Lincoln Way, and south of Jefferson. Now, you wrote in this chapter originally that same location could have been where Alanson Hurd, Mishawaka's founding father, he thought about creating a dam there, right?
Yes. In 1832, Alanson Hurd sends his scout, William Earl, to scout out bog iron deposits that there were reports of in that part of what now is Mishawaka. So if you can imagine the area around the Scout Res, which would be south of Lincoln Way, Revere Wood, that area, there was bog iron there. And ultimately, there was enough bog iron for Alanson Hurd to be able to justify constructing an ironworks in what is now downtown Mishawaka. But when he saw the iron supply there, he thought, well, we could build the dam that we need for power to turn their water turbines. We could build that in the Twin Branch area. But then he looked at the area that is downtown Mishawaka today, the area where Central Park is and where the dam currently exists. And there was a natural fall in the river there, 2 feet 9 inches, I've read, something like that. And he felt that was a better site for his dam to provide power. They dug races on both sides of the river. And so then his adjacent settlement of St. Joseph Ironworks was just right to the south of of the actual ironworks itself. And so that's why downtown Mishawaka is where it is, but it very easily could have been different where he said, okay, I'm going to build a dam close to where the bog iron supply is. I'm going to make my town right next to it. And so perhaps downtown Mishawaka could be the intersection of Lincoln Way East and Capitol Avenue today if he had chosen differently.
Right.
And then, of course, everything else would have been different about the geography of Mishawaka, where the streets are, where the schools are. So.
That's wild. that would be something that could possibly had an effect on Granger and Penn's growth out in that area too.
Right.
That's wild to think about. But he ultimately chose right there where we're familiar with Central Park, currently Buter Park area, right downtown. But we will talk about the origins of the Twin Branch Dam. It was originally called the Hen Island Dam because there's a little island that's right between where the dam is at now and Capitol. And then later on, it was called the Twin Branch Dam. Let's talk about who was involved and why. And I think our listeners will recognize a few of the notable names around 1900, right?
Sure. The name they would most likely be familiar with is Martin Beeger, who was the president of Mishawaka Woolen Manufacturing Company. And, of course, the Beeger Mansion in Mishawaka was started by him and his wife and finished by his wife a few years later. Martin died in 1903, so he didn't actually live to see the completion of the dam. It was another month and a half, 2 months after his death that the dam finally became operational, but he knew it was coming. Also, Emmett Saunders, who was another important executive with Mishawaka Woolen. He was involved with the dam project. And so it's no coincidence, nor is it just some philanthropic act by Beeger and Saunders that they get involved with constructing this huge dam. They needed a good supply of cheap electricity for ball band. And they recognized that. And so the best option they had in 1903 was to build a dam, hydroelectric dam. And then ball band would have whatever power it needed. They could invest in whatever turbines and generators that they needed to receive the electricity from that dam and then to power their equipment there in downtown Mishawaka. Another name that has significance to South Bend was James Duchesne. He was a patent attorney in South Bend, and so he was another important leader in the dam project. And then they had investors from the East. So there may not have been enough local capital in 1900 to carry this out, but they could bring in the money that they needed to build this expensive dam. And then later on, Charles Chapin takes over ownership of the dam and several dams in the area. And, of course, Chapin is a name that we're
locally around
with
here
in the area.
And, you had just mentioned about investors from the East Coast. It also goes to show that these were probably pretty darn savvy businessmen, and nothing happens in a vacuum. It's not like all of a sudden, I'm going to build a dam and people automatically invest. It's probably networking, relationships they've built, and those things, right?
Sure.
In order to be a good salesman to convince people to contribute, and it's not like these people could have got on TV and checked out where they're talking about or anything. I mean, it's 1900.
Some of those Eastern investors, I'm sure, never came to Mishawaka. Never saw that dam, but they were investing in the capital. They were venture capitalists. And I think this would have been a fairly safe investment. As significant and large as that dam was, they knew it was going to make money. They knew it was going to work. It was going to generate electricity. It would generate profits or dividends for the stockholders.
And you also wrote that the St. Joseph and Elkhart Power Company, they're the ones who Beeger and Saunders got together. They're the ones who were driving this. They bought all of the land from where the Twin Branch Dam is now, east to Elkhart. They bought all the land on both sides of the river. Why is that?
And that's about 8 miles.
That's insane.
And there's a couple of reasons they needed to do that. One is because east of the dam, so upriver of the dam,
Okay.
that was going to be flooded.
Yeah.
And so essentially it's a lake.
Mm-hmm.
People don't realize this. And prior
Right.
to writing this article, I never thought of it as a lake. It was just like when you're crossing the Bittersweet Bridge.
Yeah.
Boy, the river gets wide here.
Uh-huh.
Well, it's because it's a lake.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Lake Chapin in Michigan. Similar kind of dynamic. It's the impoundment or the backwater from the dam. And so they knew that was going to happen.
Right.
Low-lying areas were going to flood. Now, if there's a bluff on the north side of the river, well, that bluff is going to continue to be the edge of the river.
Yes.
But elsewhere, when that water rises, it's going to flood.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had to own that land. Otherwise, the property owners are going to get upset. Hey, you're flooding my land. I expect some compensation for that. So it was easier just to buy that land.
Right.
Also, they needed to buy that land to prevent anybody else from trying to construct a dam to the east along that stretch of the river. And so and then as they're getting ready to flood the land, they're cutting down trees because they know those trees are going to die. But they also needed some lumber during the process of constructing the dam or even the barracks that the workers lived in during the construction.
Wow. So they had to think, they're almost playing chess almost, thinking 2 steps ahead of everything. Like, what if we do start this construction of the dam and then somebody who owns land towards Elkhart could do the same thing we're doing? So they thought ahead, like you said, the timber they used, they said, well, we own this land anyway. These trees and this, lumber is ours. So they used that towards it as well. Right around the same time they got started in the early 1800s, there was a little bit of interstate conflict, a few courtroom dramas going on. So talk to us about that.
Yes, the lawyers got involved. And there's multiple cases that are going on. There's one court case that dealt with the construction of a dam near Berrien Springs. And that doesn't directly impact the Twin Branch power plant, but Indiana and Michigan, they were haggling over who would build the dam and who would control it. And that ultimately made its way to Congress, where the Michigan representatives and the Indiana representatives are trying to get past competing pieces of legislation.
Right.
But the more pertinent case for us with the Twin Branch Dam involves a court case between the St. Joseph and Elkhart Power Company, which is the parent company of the Twin Branch Dam, and then the Indiana Power Company. The Indiana Power Company was trying to build a dam close to where the county line is. There's a bridge there at Ash Road, County Line Road today, somewhere in that vicinity. They wanted to build a dam. And so there couldn't have been both dams within a few miles of each other. So that had to get resolved. And that went from the local circuit courts to the Indiana Supreme Court. And then eventually that case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court.
Amazing.
And basically, the final ruling from the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, was that the Indiana Supreme Court had the final say. It had jurisdiction.
Right.
Now, if it were an interstate kind of dispute, then the U.S. Supreme Court might have had jurisdiction.
Makes sense.
But basically, I think the U.S. Supreme Court said, we don't need to hear this because the Indiana Supreme Court has final authority over it. It's an intra-state dispute, and the Indiana Supreme Court had ruled in favor of the Twin Branch Dam. So there was that resolved in favor of the Twin Branch Dam. And then in 1903, kind of even as the dam had been, well underway in its construction, another company called the St. Joseph River Navigation Company,
Lordy.
they sought a federal court order to stop construction of the dam so that they wanted to build a series of locks along the river so that the river would be navigable.
Still,
And it's just completely unrealistic what they were trying to do because, I mean, there were towns, there were industries along the river. Where do you put these locks? Where do you have navigable waterway for ships to go along? So that got tossed out. The judge threw out their request for an injunction, and at that point, it's smooth sailing, and they open the dam or get it operational a few months later.
And one of the best quotes that you wrote in this chapter: "This damn mess was finally resolved on October 20th, 1902, when the High Court dismissed the Indiana Power Company's claim for want of jurisdiction."
Glad you caught that.
I love it. A brief word from one of our sponsors. I want to thank the Mishawaka Historical Museum for helping to support our content, and I couldn't be happier to help support them and to continue to share the good word about the museum. I highly recommend that our listeners visit, and I promise that you'll learn something new about our area's history. You'll experience what is hands down the most comprehensive collection of artifacts and historical background, all specific to Mishawaka, Indiana. You will learn tons from the artifacts and corresponding information. You'll learn how early industry was crucial to Mishawaka, Cam and Schellinger Brewery, Ball Band, and Dodge Manufacturing, to name a few. You'll learn about famous Mishawakans, including professional baseball player Freddie Fitzsimmons or Coach Marvin Wood, the coach depicted in the movie Hoosiers, who also coached at Mishawaka High School as well. Speaking of Mishawaka schools, there's a whole section dedicated to the history of schooling in Mishawaka, including some real neat old uniforms, banners, and photographs. Speaking of photographs, the museum contains one-of-a-kind pictures depicting a variety of Mishawaka subjects, each with a caption explaining more about it. In the military heritage section, you'll learn about Mishawaka's role over the years in helping to keep our country free. In the historic landmarks section, you'll see some amazing pictures and artifacts from historical Mishawaka landmarks, some still standing and some that were sadly lost to time. There's also a section dedicated to the importance of churches and religion to the city. And if you ever have any questions about any of the artifacts or information the museum contains, Pete DeKever, the president and curator of the museum, is an absolute tank of knowledge about Mishawaka, and he is there to answer any specific questions you have or to provide more background to any of the museum's artifacts. If you and a group of friends or family are looking for something to do and want a guided tour, the museum offers those as well. Again, folks, I highly encourage you to visit the Mishawaka Historical Museum. You don't need to plan an all-day visit. 1 or 2 hours is all you need to experience everything that I mentioned above and much, much more. They're open Tuesday, Friday, and Saturday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. For only a $5 entrance fee, $3 for children 6 to 18, and free for 5 years and younger, you can experience a local gem of a place at 121 South Main Street, just south of the Lincoln Way and Main Street intersection. When you stop in, tell them that you heard about the museum on our podcast. Again, I'm very excited to be spreading the good word and encouraging you all to visit. To learn more, visit their website at www.mishawakamuseum.org, or the link is also in our show notes. And now, back to the episode. Folks, you'll obviously have to read the chapter in the book to get the full picture. But after all the roadblocks, finally the construction of the dam and the powerhouse that is on the dam could begin. And this gives a sense of the time and when they built this in the early 1900s. Work on the dam and powerhouse proceeded with a combination of manual labor, horse-drawn equipment, and steam power. This is not some little beaver dam made of sticks. I mean, this was quite the massive projects, especially in the early 1900s. What are 1 or 2, remarkable things that had to be done just to prepare and construct the actual dam?
They really had to redirect the course of the river so that they could build the powerhouse. And the powerhouse really extends out into the channel where the river is today. And they had to go all the way down to bedrock. So it's like 35 feet below river level.
Yeah.
And so massive amounts of concrete, but they first had to build the pilings. So they were driving pilings into the bedrock. And then, of course, lots more concrete as they're building the rest of the dam. But it's 400 feet wide from one bank to the other. And basically took about 3 years for it to be completed. They brought in 100 Italian laborers to actually do much of the work. Canadian lumberjacks cut down the trees along the river. And then they were using those trees that they had felled. They let them float down the river, the entire tree trunks. And then they had sort of a boom across the river collecting these trees. And then as the sawmill, they created a sawmill there.
On site.
As they needed wood for one part of the project or another, they had a huge steam derrick that, like a big claw that would lift a tree trunk like it was a wisp of straw, according to one account, and just lift it out of the river, take it over to this sawmill, cut it up as needed, and use it. So we have a couple pictures that show the construction underway, and it is just an amazing thing to consider the activity that was occurring there. And you can stand at that dam as we did, and you have to remind yourself that somebody had to build this.
Yes.
It wasn't just there. It's not a natural feature.
Nope.
This was an enormous amount of labor that was invested for those 3 years to create something that totally did not exist before.
And it's amazing. And you mentioned 400 feet. A football field is 300 feet. So we're talking a football field and a third more on top of that across the river in 1900, 1901, 1902. It's just amazing.
And you're not seeing all of it.
Yeah, because a lot of it's you're only seeing the top.
It's going down to the bedrock.
That's insane.
So there's 35 feet plus, below water level that you can't see. There's a lot of concrete that you can see.
Correct.
When you're standing there. And then there's so much more below the surface.
It's wild. It's wild. And to think about it was all in the early 1900s. And when you mentioned horsepower and good God.
Right.
Do you know if any of I just thought of this question. Do you know if any of the workers, were there any fatalities or anything?
I did not come across any accounts of that.
Okay.
So it's certainly possible, but I did not see anything referred to in any of the articles.
There might, who knows, but it was something that massive at that time in our country.
It would have been expected.
Yes, definitely. You had written that in October of 1903, the construction of the dam and the powerhouse on the dam had finished. And I love this part, and we were talking about it when we were out there the other day. Citizens were waiting for the water to rise over the dam to start creating power. And on November 20th, the Mishawaka Enterprise noted that the water was near the top. Talk to us about why this was the talk of the town.
Yeah, they were really
just
excited.
Watching water.
Let's go watch the water rise. And then maybe we'll be lucky and see it go over the top. I think they knew, they certainly had been following the saga of this dam. They knew it was a big deal to have this dam constructed. And I think they understood that when the water starts going over, it might be visually interesting. But that's when the turbines start turning. And we get cheap electricity to light our homes. So they knew the significance of it. And, it's not just something where we look back and see the importance of it. They were living it.
Correct.
They knew that this was a big deal to get that dam generating power. And it was significant to the future industrial development of Mishawaka, the population growth of Mishawaka, and the surrounding area. And it was something to go watch.
Something to behold. Yeah, they're not watching YouTube videos or anything like that. I mean, they didn't even have radio.
It's important to understand that. And from that time period, what do you do for entertainment? You gather together in groups. There's no radio, there's no television. You could read a newspaper, but people created crowds more easily then than they do now. We live our own lives in our houses and whatnot, or in restaurants, in smaller groups. But back then, you get references to 1,000, 2,000 people showing up for things.
That's amazing.
In ways that they don't so easily do today.
Of course, yeah. And today we're so connected, we're almost disconnected.
Right. We're connected with the rest of the world.
Correct.
Through our media, but not as connected to what's going on in our community.
True.
In person.
True. Totally true. Now, the building of the Twin Branch Dam, we mentioned earlier, would flood, and they knew that. It pretty drastically changed the landscape of the river from the dam east to Elkhart. And I encourage anybody just to get on Google Maps after you're done listening to this and look. You could see the water is remarkably wider. Just talk to us a little bit about some of the how the landscape changed.
Yes, and we can only really kind of imagine how much it changed, but the references I found in the sources, they talk about 400 to 1,000 feet.
Wow.
Wider.
That's
or wide at some
2.5
point.
times.
So, it's just wider there than it is anywhere else in Mishawaka, like to the west of the dam, downriver of the dam. And there was actually a term that they used for that wider body of water. They called it Lake Eberhard. So that's a historical term that you find in the early 20th century that has completely passed out of popular use. And I know the Eberhard family, they own property, the area along Bittersweet. It was Burkado Farm, and that may be where Lake Eberhard came from. But just like there's Lake Chapin, Lake Eberhard. And I wish we'd resurrect that name.
Yeah.
And remind people this isn't just a really wide river, although yes, technically it is, but it is essentially a lake created by a river flooding its backwater.
Yeah, it's still just mind-boggling how much it can change the landscape of it, right? Then I think you'd mentioned earlier by Bittersweet, it's
really wide there.
It's amazingly wide.
Yeah.
And that was because of the Twin Branch Dam.
Yes. Right. You are right in the middle of Lake Eberhard.
That is crazy. Also, there were we talked about history being cause and effect. And when we were talking the other day about the relationship between the dam and immigrants coming to Mishawaka area, we often don't equate or make that correlation of the Twin Branch Dam and population increases and those immigrants, but there's a direct correlation, right?
Yes.
Or there has to be.
There is. And there is one intermediary step, and that's industry.
Yes.
That dam was made not just to light people's homes. It was, as we said earlier, built to power industry.
Yes.
To enable existing industry to have a more reliable, cheap supply of power, but also so that industry could expand. More factories could come to Mishawaka, South Bend, and the surrounding area. And so once you have industry expanding because of cheap electricity and readily available electricity, well, then who's coming? The immigrants.
Yes.
Those immigrants are coming to work in those factories. They're coming to work at the Belgian Shoe College.
Yep.
They're at Ball Band. They're working at Dodge. The Simplex Motor Car Company on Burkett Street. They're coming into existence in that first decade of the 20th century. And so there are lots of immigrant stories that take place here in Mishawaka. And it's not because they're coming here for the weather.
No.
or just jobs spontaneously open up to them. It's because at a deeper root cause, it's because there's cheap power.
Yep.
And so it's a lesson for us. If you want economic growth, if you want factory jobs, et cetera, or commercial development, make sure you have a reliable, large supply of cheap power.
Yep. Makes sense. Totally makes sense. So, folks, next time you drive past the Twin Branch Dam, think of your own family lineage.
Right.
Maybe a relative, your great-great-great-grandfather moved here because of work at one of the local industries that was powered by the Twin Branch Dam.
And that's my family story. Again, this is something I didn't really realize until I wrote this article and did this research and just kind of pondered the cause and effect. My great-grandfather comes here about 1906. And then 2 years later, the rest of the family comes from Belgium in 1908, including my grandfather. And it's no coincidence that they come here right in the period of time, right after the opening of the Twin Branch Dam, when local industry is booming and hiring more people. And so I can thank the Twin Branch Dam and Martin Beeger and Emmett Saunders and others for building that dam, for bringing my family to Mishawaka.
That's so neat. That's cool. I love it. All this history right under our noses. And now a word from one of our sponsors. I want to talk a minute about the government of Portage Township right here in South Bend. Portage Township trustee Jason Critchlow and his team continue to fight for regular working families of South Bend every single day. And they are getting results. Their work continues to go beyond just providing temporary emergency assistance to families in crisis, which is important for the stability of our community. They have taken on major issues like renters' rights, fighting for the residents of Cedar Glen apartment complex. They created a new fire territory to increase public safety. And Portage Township's Health and Eating Initiative, Nourish, is working to increase the health of low-income populations. Trustee Jason is even supporting local public education in a campaign to educate the community by bringing transparency to the local government processes. This year, in partnership with Real Services, Portage Township even opened the area's only permanent senior community center called the Portage Commons at Colfax and William Street in downtown South Bend. Learn more about these services and much, much more at portage-township.com. The link is in the show notes. A heartfelt thank you to Jason and your team for all that you do for our area. You wrote that by 1922, so just a mere 2 decades after it was the dam was constructed, that it needed more muscle to keep up because local industry was expanding and homes were adding electrical devices like radios and washing machines. Talk to us about the huge changes that the Twin Branch Dam faced in the 1920s.
Yes. So in 1922, the changes that were made included a new concrete structure on top of the original dam.
So that's what we see now.
That's basically what you see today, yes.
Okay.
I think what you see today is very similar to what you would have found in photographs from the mid-20s after the upgrade had taken place. So the original dam, it's really just kind of like a wall, I guess you might describe it as, where the water would flow over it, and you see this long, 400-foot long cascading waterfall, essentially, and there's nothing above it. But when they upgraded the dam, they installed the new concrete structure, 7 steel tainter gates, which could be used to control the amount of water going through. And then that allowed the power company to determine the level of the river downstream.
Wow.
And of course, even to this day, they're able to do
still
that.
Control it.
And periodically, they'll announce that they're going to adjust the height of the dam. So water levels are going to be higher or lower for whatever reason. And then they also added 2 more turbine generators to the powerhouse. So the original powerhouse from 1903 had 4 of those turbine generators. 2 more were added, thus increasing the amount of electrical production that the dam was capable of.
Right. They also, on the north bank of the river near the dam, they built pretty much what ended up being a staple there until the late 70s, right? A coal-fired steam plant. Right.
So, and that's the key understanding that we need to have in terms of when we think of Twin Branch. It's a dam ever since 1903, but it shows you also the demand was growing so much in our area that even an upgraded Twin Branch Dam from 1922, that wasn't going to do the job anymore. That was not enough. It continued to produce a relatively small amount of electricity compared to the steam plant that they built. So it's late 1923 when they do the groundbreaking for the Twin Branch power plant or steam plant. We can use either term. And then it's being built in 1924 and it's finished and ready to turn on May 14th, 1925. So we are in the 100th anniversary
Literally.
of the first kilowatts being generated by the first turbo generator that came online. Then a second one came online shortly after, within weeks or months. But it was the evening of May 14th, 1925.
That's in 2 days.
And it's interesting that
will be the 100th anniversary.
You know, that was such a big month for Mishawaka. Mishawaka High School was dedicated on May 5th.
Okay.
The auditorium at Mishawaka High School was first used on May 5th. The cafeteria was completed and first used on May 14th. And then later that evening, the Twin Branch Power Plant comes online. And then a week later, the Tivoli Theater has its opening night, May 21st, 1925. It's got to be one of the most exciting and significant months in Mishawaka history.
The roaring 20s.
Right.
Booming 20s.
We were a boom town.
That's right.
Yeah.
Literally mid-19, smack dab in the middle of the roaring 20s. Yeah, that would have had to been heck of a week or heck of a month.
Yeah. And as a historian, 100 years later, it's kept me really busy this month. I've had all kinds of Facebook posts and my column in the Mishawaka Enterprise. I'm covering all of these 100th anniversaries that occurred a century ago this month.
And if you weren't covering them, who would be?
They would all be forgotten, I think.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you. All right. How about you, Pete? Just physically describe the actual steam plant for a moment, because like we said, it only lasted till the late 70s. And so folks my age and younger have no clue.
Yes. The Twin Branch steam plant, it actually evolved over time.
Okay.
So in 1925, what opens, there's two 40,000 kilowatt turbines that were operational there in the spring of 1925. And then they knew they were going to add on to it over time.
Yeah.
And I know around 1940, 41, there's an addition that's put on. And the last addition is around 1949. And at that point, the building assumes its final appearance, the appearance that I remember. And that building in later years, it was at least 400 feet long. It ran parallel to the river on the north bank. So basically an east-west kind of orientation to the building. And it had smokestacks. So the original power plant had 2 smokestacks. And the final version, there were 4 smokestacks, this quartet of 4 smokestacks. And the tops of the smokestacks, they were even, about 175 feet tall, I estimate. But the smokestacks, they were of different heights because the roof line was different. It varied as they put on additions. But the tops of the smokestacks were roughly in line with each other. And it was... even when the first part of it opened in 1925, it was a huge building.
Yeah.
But it just kept getting bigger and bigger. And I remember it vividly. We lived half a mile from the Twin Branch power plant.
You lived right there.
Yeah, just down the river.
Yeah.
We were on the river just downstream. And the particular memory I have of the Twin Branch power plant is being several miles away on Grape Road. When you're by the mall and you're crossing over the toll road, you get to see some distance. And you could see clearly the Twin Branch power plant way off to the southeast. And those 4 smokestacks, the big bulk of that building. And so, I mean, it was always a large building from when it was first built. And it just kept getting bigger, and it was a massive structure. But even more impressive, of course, was its product. Its only product, power, electricity.
And when you look at the old aerials that are on the St. Joe County, there's a website that shows old aerials, and it starts in like 1938, I think. It also produced a heck of a lot of smoke, because in some of those aerials, you could see it captured not only the monstrosity of the building, but also the smoke. The steam, the
smokestacks are there for a reason.
Wow.
And I have one picture that was taken about 1970, 71, right near the end of when they were using all of their generating units.
Yeah.
After that, they started to shut them down.
Taper them
But
off.
there's one picture that shows all 4 smokestacks with smoke coming out of it.
Yeah.
And these were big, wide smokestacks, and there was just a thick cloud shooting up out of each of those smokestacks. But that's what you get when you have
of course.
a coal-fired steam plant. The whole process is basically it's very complex, but you could boil it down to a combination of coal and water and heat. And the end result is enormous amounts of electricity. And we could go into the details of how you get from the coal ultimately to the electricity, but that's really what it is. So you need to have coal, you need to have water, and then it's the enormously complex intricacies inside that building that make the magic happen and churn out huge amounts of electricity.
Folks, this was all right near Capitol and Jefferson Boulevard, that intersection there. It's currently an industrial park, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, how it transformed into that. But this giant plant was all right there. And today you could see a lot. There's still grids, there's still power lines there, but there's nothing like that there right now. It's just amazing that was there. You mentioned the sheer amount of coal. Even when the steam plant started, they needed, you wrote, 1,100 ton daily appetite. And then even a couple decades later, it was 4 times that. So the need for coal was so critical that they even built their own railroad tracks. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, and that's another amazing part of the story of the Twin Branch Power Plant, is that they constructed the Twin Branch Railroad, which was billed at the time as the world's shortest railroad. It had about 1.3 miles of track from the plant property north to the Elkhart and Western Railroad, which was connected to the New York Central Railroad, came from Elkhart, continued on into downtown Mishawaka. Then there were about 2 more miles of track inside the plant in terms of sidings and yard track, we would call it.
Okay.
But basically the existence of the Twin Branch Railroad was to get coal from the Elkhart and Western into the plant. They had a couple locomotives. They didn't own the coal cars. The coal cars were delivered there through those other railroads, but they were responsible for getting it from the Elkhart and Western onto the plant property. And so that railroad continued to operate until 1978.
Wow. That's a good year. That's the year I was born. It's still amazing. And like we're talking about, this isn't 1,100 pounds at first. This is 1,100 tons. I mean, that is massive. And then they ended up over 4,000 tons a day, you had mentioned.
And my favorite part about the Twin Branch Railroad is the rotary car dumper.
Okay, yeah, you have a picture of it in there too,
in the book, and it's one of those things that I had never heard of before until I started doing this research.
Yeah,
and it's got to be the coolest piece of industrial equipment in any Mishawaka factory. And the Twin Branch Power Plant was a factory.
Yeah,
you need to think of it in those terms, and it just made one thing, and that's electricity.
Yes,
but these coal trains would come in. Sometimes 130 cars filled with coal. And so how do you get the coal into the plant out of the coal cars? And so they would uncouple the cars one at a time, and they roll the car into this kind of cylindrical device, lock it in place, and the rotary car dumper, as the name suggests, would rotate around, flip it over, and all the coal would pour down into like a bunker and then ultimately into a conveyor. And then they would flip it back around, push it out, move the next car in. And, we in the 21st century, we think we are so great with all of our amazing pieces of equipment. They invented that at least by 1925 and installed it and used it for decades. And it is a remarkable piece of equipment. Yeah, there's no microchips involved and no computers. It's just hydraulics probably and mechanical energy. But what a cool thing. And I wish if I could go back in time for just a little bit, I'd go to the Twin Branch power plant and I'd watch them just empty the coal cars using the rotary car dumper.
It's like the cars are little matchbox cars almost.
It's like little toys.
But we're talking massive train cars being just turned over just
one
like the little
another,
toys all day long.
It would take a few minutes to do one car, and then you'd move on. So I'm sure there were guys whose job it was to operate the rotary car dumper all day long.
All day long. That's wild. More of the interview in a moment, but first, a word from another one of our sponsors. I want to thank MT Box Computers for helping to support our podcast and our content. Located at 2921 Mishawaka Avenue in South Bend, right in the heart of River Park, MT Box Computers can help your business reduce its cost and increase its productivity. MT Box Computers is a full-service computer and network solution company. Their technicians are certified by industry-leading standards. They work with small and medium-sized businesses in the Michiana area to provide computer-related support, as they not only understand technology, but they also understand the day-to-day needs of small businesses. They strive to find the best solution for your business. Through experience, they have found that most companies have different needs, and those needs require different solutions. They'd love the opportunity to evaluate your business's current technology environment and discuss ways that they can increase your productivity and save you money. Check out their website at mtboxcomputers.com to learn more. A link to their website is in the show notes. And now, back to the episode. We also mentioned the sheer size of it. You had mentioned in the chapter, and then also we're just talking about that until University Park Mall was constructed and until parts of the AM General plant were constructed, that Twin Branch power plant was the largest structure in Mishawaka.
Yes. Because, when you think about Ball Band and Dodge, they're a collection of multiple buildings.
Yeah.
And even Mishawaka High School was not as large as the Twin Branch power plant was. But the Twin Branch power plant was under one roof. It had additions put onto it, but it was one continuous structure. And just the massiveness. When you think about the Twin Branch power plant, the word massive, it's almost obligatory. You have to use that many times when trying to describe this. And it was just an enormous building. And all the more remarkable today is that it's completely gone.
Yeah.
There's not a brick left from that building standing on that site.
It's just woods. I mean, just overgrowth.
It's woods, right?
That's like almost 50-year-old woods is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
That's wild. You also wrote that the Twin Branch power plant was a technological marvel and the most significant and complex industrial building ever to operate in Mishawaka. Talk to us about that.
Yes, and this is something I really came to an appreciation of as I was reading summaries and descriptions of just how did they make the electricity? How did they get from the coal in the water to electricity? And here's some of what they had to do, just briefly and generally describing what happened. So the coal arrived by train. It was dumped, as we described. The coal then had to be crushed into a certain size of piece and then left on these outdoor stockpiles. And then a conveyor belt would take it into the plant. Then further crushing was done. So there were crushers within the plant that basically ground it to a fine powder. And then that powder was injected into the furnace. It's like blasted into the furnace, and that's what's creating the heat. But they can't just take the original pieces of coal, however large they were, an inch or two. It has to become a fine powder when it gets in the plant and is part of that process. So it's incinerated in the furnace and heats water into steam. And well, where are they getting the water? Of course, it's coming off the St. Joseph River. It goes through the screen house that we saw. It's
still there.
The old screen house is still there. There are 3 historic outbuildings that they were part of the plant's production, but they were not physically part of the long building. And so the water has to be filtered through the screen house, make sure there are no fish, no debris. And so it's just pure water. And then, in fact, the water inside the plant then gets purified. It's like turned into soft water so that it doesn't hurt the pipes and the equipment of the plant. So the water's turned in, there's high level of heat, turns the water into steam, and then the steam spins a turbine.
Okay.
And so you've got this rotating turbine that is making the electricity ultimately. You got to get something spinning. And so it's the combination of the heat and the steam that cause the turbine to spin and to make the electricity. And then there are other steps that we won't go into, but that's essentially the bottom line is you've got to turn that water into steam. And to do that, you need heat, which comes from the coal. And then that electricity was sent throughout our region, but also it could be sent. They did tests where they sent it to Boston. They sent it to Florida. If there was need for it, they could send electricity from Twin Branch to Chicago. They had connections to that. On a regular basis, there were places in Ohio that were receiving electricity from the Twin Branch plant. And so you see pictures of the inside of that plant, and there are these enormous pieces of equipment that are blowers or fans or crushers and pipes. You just imagine the miles and miles of pipes that were inside that building. And they had to keep it running all those years.
It's wild.
That's
nuts.
A very complex piece of equipment.
That's nuts. It just is. As you're talking, it reaffirms what I wrote in my notes here is that that operation was huge. You wrote that in the peak in the mid-'60s that it had 250 employees. Just the Twin Branch plant itself had 250 employees working 24/7. Engineers, chemists, maintenance, office workers. It's wild. It reaffirms how big that was.
Right. Yeah, it was a significant employer. And again, all that complexity requires very specialized skills.
Yes.
And those guys made it work.
It's just amazing. Then you wrote that as the Cook nuclear plant was built in the mid to late 70s, that this was a, quote, reminder that the Twin Branch power plant was a dinosaur limping into its final years of service. Just talk about towards the end in the 1970s about the, I don't want to say demise, that's kind of negative, about the end of the plant.
It's a reminder that a coal-fired power plant like Twin Branch, it's very complex. And the more complex something is, the easier it is for it to become outdated. Obsolescent.
Makes sense.
And by the early 1970s, the Twin Branch plant had become basically outdated. The reason that I&M kept it going was because there was such a large growing demand for electricity that they couldn't afford to shut it down.
Okay.
Even though it wasn't very efficient anymore, it was probably difficult to operate because it was so old at that point. But even then, by 1971, they had shut down 2 of the units. There were 5 units. Unit 3 was just like on emergency standby basis. So it's basically units 4 and 5 that were operating from 1973 until when they shut it down in 1979 and finally and retired it in 1980. And once the Cook nuclear plant opened its first unit in 1975, there was a significant increase in capacity that I&M had because of that. And then they opened their second unit in 1978. And again, going back to the idea of cause and effect, I&M can shut down the Twin Branch plant once the Cook nuclear plant is available. Now, the larger utility, they had other coal-fired power plants in Sullivan, Indiana, and then in Lawrenceburg. They were larger than the Twin Branch plant was at that time. And so I&M didn't just have, or AEP at that point, didn't just have the Cook Nuclear Plant in Twin Branch, they had other coal-fired power plants. But
Okay.
because the Twin Branch plant was so old and so outdated, I think once Cook came online, then it's just a matter of, okay, when can we shut down
Yeah.
Twin Branch? And particularly when the second Cook unit comes online, 1978, that's why the end of the Twin Branch plant follows so quickly after that,
They were
1979.
ready. Yeah. It was part of the plan, the next step, the next step.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
We mentioned that the steam power plant was decommissioned by 1980. What's there today in that whole area?
Sure. The steam plant, ends its production in 1980. Demolition takes place from 1983 to 1985. So you got this enormous building. It's got to come down. There's zero use for it.
Right.
And so I&M hires a company to do the demolition. And then what happens after that is the huge area where the rail yard was and the coal pile, which actually after 1973, there also were 2 large oil tanks. The plant had been converted to fuel oil from 1973 until it's ceased production.
So barely in anything, only a few years, really.
So you've got these enormous fuel tanks. They have to go, the remnants of the coal stockpile that was kept for the emergency unit, that goes. So you've got a large area on the east half of the property that can be completely repurposed, and it becomes the Twin Branch Energy Park.
Okay.
And so that starts in the late 1980s. There's a variety of small commercial and industrial buildings. Actually, some of them are quite large, but they are filling much of the property.
I see.
Where the power plant was, as we mentioned, it's just woods and undergrowth. There are buildings that are used for the hydroelectric plant, so operating the dam. So the office for the AEP facility, the I&M facility, it's in the former coal handling substation. It's a 2-3-story building. Adjacent to it, there's like a machine shop, and actually that's the building that the locomotives went into.
Yeah.
That was like the house for the locomotives. And if you go inside that building, there actually are rails.
That's neat.
Where you can see the train would have pulled, the locomotive would have pulled up to. So that building is there. And then the screen house by the river is there. It doesn't seem to be used for anything anymore, but it's right there alongside the river. And then there is also another, like an industrial testing facility that would have been just to the west of the power plant. It's Bechtel Industries that uses it today. And then there's a huge area of transformers, substations that are part of the I&M network.
Right.
And of course, the dam still operational. Its powerhouse is on the south bank of the river, and they have 8 turbine generators. None of the originals are still being used. It's 8 newer turbine generators. So the dam looks pretty much the way it has since 1903, or at least since the upgrades were made in the 1920s. And so the area where the steam plant was, that's very different today than it would have been when it was under production.
And if anybody has gone to the dog park over there or the marina area, that was a part of the I&M, or that was a part of the land, right?
Right. So 2 parcels of land were given away or leased, essentially given away by I&M while the plant was still in existence. So around 1970, the Marina Park at the far east end of the I&M property, the city of Mishawaka negotiated with I&M to give the city that land to make it into a park, which later was named Margaret Prickett Marina Park after she left office. And then about 10 years after that, the Twin Branch State Fish Hatchery, which today is the Richard Bodine State Fish Hatchery, essentially it's adjacent to the Marina Park. So that was another several acres that was given away. I&M knew that they weren't going to be
Right.
ever running a coal-fired power plant. They wouldn't need all that land. And so they were giving it for some environmentally friendly uses.
Yes.
When you consider all of the
opposite of that.
All the coal production that was occurring there.
Yes.
And we should note also that not on the historic I&M property, but not too far away, is the Twin Branch Solar Power Plant.
Yes.
Which is operated by I&M. It's
Okay.
a pilot project that opened in 2016.
Okay.
And it's about a mile north of the historic site, right alongside, just north of the Elkhart and Western tracks. And as we noted when we made our visit out there, there is a wonderful historical irony that at that junction where the Twin Branch Railroad came off the Elkhart and Western and then went south through what today is the AM General Plant, right at that junction, about 100 feet to the north, is the entrance into the solar power plant. And so the legacy of power production continues at Twin Branch on the east end of Mishawaka. The dam is still humming along after 122 years. And then we have this new experiment bearing the Twin Branch name, producing power in a very different way.
Very different.
Than what had traditionally been done for 55 years, especially with the steam plant there at Twin Branch.
Yeah.
So the story continues.
It definitely continues. We'll wrap it up with this, but you had written in there that the electricity and the power created at the Twin Branch Dam and Steam Plant, I mean, and as we've talked about, it powered Mishawaka's industry, ball band, Dodge, Bendix. But you also mentioned that it powered everything else from schools, hospitals, houses, streetlights ran on this electricity. And I love this. You had written that the first lights that the newborns saw at St. Joe Hospital, or the lights at Tupper Field, the first radios in the 1920s, or the first TVs in the 1950s were provided with Twin Branch electricity. Let's wrap it up and just talk about the overall impact that this once mighty plant had.
Yes. And it's easy just to take for granted where our electricity comes from.
Right.
And just like we take it for granted today,
I do.
I'm sure, by the 1930s or even in the 19-teens, they weren't thinking, thank goodness we have that hydroelectric dam there in Twin Branch, so I can, turn on my electric devices. You just kind of take it for granted.
Right.
But when we look back and when we look deeply, as we're doing in our conversation today, you realize how much that electricity impacted people's lives. And I was thinking today, about my grandfather when he came here in 1908, whatever electric devices they had in their little house there on Wells Street, that power was coming from the Twin Branch Dam. And when my dad was born in 1943, he would have been that newborn at St. Joseph Hospital, and the lights in the delivery room were powered by Twin Branch electricity, mostly from the steam plant. And all that wonderful history of Mishawaka High School that we talk about. Well, when that building opened in 1924, that power was coming from the dam, and as they added on to it, that power was coming from the steam plant. And so it just impacted people every day in every way, even if they didn't pause to think about it.
That's so awesome. That is so neat. Well, hey, thank you, Pete, for coming on again.
You're welcome.
As always, your insight and how deep you dive and dig into our local history, specifically Mishawaka's history, kudos. Thank you, because as we talked about, if you're not doing it, who's going to do it? Thank you. Thank you once again for listening to another episode of Round the Bend Now and Then. An extra special thanks to reoccurring guest Pete DeKever. Pete, thank you for all that you do to keep Mishawaka history alive, and thank you for your time today. Folks, please share our podcast with anybody who you think would appreciate it, and also be sure to follow us on all of our social media platforms. Join us again next time as we learn more about South Bend and Mishawaka's Now and Then.